The Books Podcast, presented by Tim Haig.
Welcome to the Books Podcast. I'm Tim Haig. One of our recurring themes is rock music. You might remember we've talked to the great Philip Norman about George Harrison and Mick Jagger and Jimi Hendrix, and also discussed the post-punk explosion with Cathy Unsworth, and so on and so on. So it was perhaps inevitable that eventually we'd come to Pink Floyd. Floyd are an absolute behemoth of rock, and well, I freely confess to being a big fan, so I was very happy when Shine On by Mark Blake dropped through the letterbox onto the mat, and I fell upon it as a starving man upon food.
Roger Waters had these bottomless well of ideas. He was the guy coming in at the beginning of Dark Side the Moon, Wish You Were Here, Animals, The Wall, and probably before that going, I've got an idea. They can still walk down the road. They're not getting mobbed. It's not like Mark Bolan. You go out in the street and you're Roger Waters, you're not getting mobbed.
I ask you, gentlemen of the jury, is this the kind of book you'd like your wives and servants to read?
Mark, thank you for joining us on Books Podcast.
A pleasure. Lovely to be here.
Pink Floyd, it's a great name for a band. Where did they get it?
They got it from two blues musicians, Pink Council and Floyd Anderson. And there's a little bit in the book about somebody was there with Syd Barrett in a cafe in Cambridge when he remembers them coming up with the name. They were looking at the back of an LP, a blues LP, probably about 1963, 64. So they had the name, I believe.
Because
anyway.
they had other names before.
They had
that,
other names. They had that name floating
the
around
Tea
for a while.
Set,
That's
which is a
right. They were
terrible
the Tea Set. It was a Pink Floyd blues band, Pink Floyd Sound, various names they messing around with. But this was at a time when they were students. They weren't necessarily that serious about it at the time.
The book's called Shine On, The Definitive Oral History of Pink Floyd. What do we mean by an oral history?
Well, it's all in their own words, or in the words of the interviewees. So you've got my sort of prose moving the story along, my little bits of narrative, but the great majority of it is in the words of, David Gilmour, Nick Mason, Roger Waters.
Oh, but everybody else as well. You've got Syd Barrett's sister. And
Syd Barrett's sister, and letters that Syd Barrett wrote to his girlfriend at the time. 2 or 3 ex-girlfriends, well, 3 of, I think, that I know of, maybe 4 even, I'm not sure. They turn up in the story as well. And it's interviews going back, in my case, nearly 30 years. I think the first interview that's quoted from in this book was something I did in 1992. So there's a lot of material I've gathered.
We have to start with Syd Barrett, who is he's the sort of the origin story, like a superhero origin story of Pink Floyd. Tell me about Syd Barrett, because he did not persist with Pink Floyd, and it's the central tragedy at the heart of the beginnings, isn't it?
Well, yes. I mean, he was Roger Barrett, as he was. Sid was a nickname that he acquired later on. He was a singer, a guitarist, wrote songs, wrote poetry, was a painter. He was an art student when he started playing in what became Pink Floyd. And, generally remembered as a very sort of precocious young man, very artistic, good-looking, very smart, a popular guy around Cambridge, seemed to be somebody that a lot of people gravitated towards. I mean, bear in mind, this is the early 60s. It's the post-war era. You've got, what you call beatniks, bohemia jazz, blues, that stuff's coming through. Young men aren't required to dress like their fathers anymore. These changes are coming in, and Sid sort of seemed to embody that if you speak to people that remember him from that time.
Now, he was the singer, songwriter, and guitarist.
Yes,
for the original Pink Floyd,
original
before
lineup.
David Gilmour. Was it his idea to have a band, or
no?
Did he join other bands?
No, he sort of played around with a couple of groups in Cambridge, but nothing serious. He was never, it was jam sessions or occasionally.
So how did he become the star of the nascent Pink
Well, because
Floyd?
he moved to London to study at Camberwell Art College, and Roger Waters, who also came from Cambridge, as a bass player in Pink Floyd, he was studying at the Regent Street Polytechnic, studying architecture, which is where he met Pink Floyd drummer Nick Mason, and they started jamming and playing parties and the odd pub gig with a band of their own, and then students dropped in and dropped out, and when Sid came down to London, they hooked up with him. Roger Waters knew him from back in Cambridge.
Yeah, because Cambridge is the...
Cambridge is central to this, yes.
To the whole Pink Floyd and the Pink Floyd family, because everything that surrounds
Well,
them,
yes. I mean,
the orbiting.
Yeah, Syd Barrett and David Gilmour, both from Cambridge.
And they were friends there.
David Gilmour and Sid Barrett were friends back in Cambridge. Yeah, they'd known each other as teenagers. I think they'd gone to France together, busking in summer 1965, I think. Yeah, so there was this strong Cambridge connection. But I mean, Nick Mason, Londoner, and Rick Wright, a keyboard player, also from North London.
So Pink Floyd wind up being, as it were, the house band for the underground, the London, not the Tube, but the underground scene. That wasn't. It just happened somehow, didn't it? They were. In fact, I think Nick Mason says they were in the right place.
They were in the right
time.
place at the right time. I think the story is with this is that obviously what they were doing, they were not necessarily fantastic musicians. I mean,
I was going to come to that.
The keyboard player Rick Wright had studied music, and I think he'd studied music properly. But the others were willing amateurs, and that's not an insult. That's just how it was at the time.
And this is before Gilmour joined.
This is long before.
How good a band were Pink Floyd at that time?
Well, I mean, there are very few recordings of them early on. I mean, the earliest stuff we've got is a demo they recorded in January '65. I mean, it's okay. It's of a standard. It's slightly odd sort of beat pop. I think they're doing other people's songs and they're doing some of their own stuff. What's interesting about it is Sid Barrett, the way he played guitar. He wasn't a conventional blues guitarist. He's not trying to rip off Eric Clapton or Peter Green, which everybody else was probably trying to do at the time. He had a slightly more idiosyncratic approach to playing the guitar, and he turned perhaps his limitations became features of what he was doing. I mean, there are all these stories about him running ball bearings up and down the strings and making noises with the guitar. Plus the way he sang in a very English accent. I mean, obviously Ray Davies of the Kinks was doing that, but great majority.
And his songwriting as well was not bluesy, and it wasn't rock. In fact, I'm probably going to offend Floyd fans. His songwriting was a bit fey. I mean,
it's very fey, yes. But I mean, early in '65, it really was just developing. I mean, there's these strange little songs. You can hear them all on the internet. These strange songs. They're unusual. There's something a bit odd about it, and you can see where it leads to what I think of as the proper songwriting that I guess he did a year or so later with things like Arnold Lane and See Emily Play, the early Floyd stuff. But it was very fey, yeah.
And it was sort of looking back to childhood and all of these things. Now, Sid became a casualty. He was an acid casualty. What happened to him? Why did it go so badly and so quickly wrong for him?
I don't think it was just a case of being an acid casualty. And one of the things I found, particularly when I interviewed his sister Rosemary a few years ago, obviously you're going to get a different perspective if you're talking to the family. The family took quite a dim view, I think, of him going to London and giving up being an art student and joining a band, because that obviously dovetails with things going wrong with him. He was somebody who's, there's some suggestion he may have been on the spectrum, Asperger's or something. None of this stuff was identified in the 60s. And this is what his sister Rosemary said to me. And others have suggested it. His brain was wired up a little differently from others, and it was noticeable in childhood. He was an unusual person. I had an unusual character. And the suggestion, I think, again, this is from the people I've spoken to who knew him, is that he was more prone to problems. You introduce psychedelics into it, the way his brain was, the way he was wired up, perhaps he was a lot more vulnerable. I mean, I've heard from 2 or 3 people, look, I took as much acid as Sid did and nothing went wrong. You hear that an awful lot.
But you also hear people who fried their minds.
And this is exactly what I think maybe happened here. I think it was a combination of things: smoking dope, combination of psychedelics, but also I think the pressure of becoming a pop star, which he had, which I don't think was ever really something he was necessarily set out to do.
Have a couple of quotes from Roger Waters. One is that what he said, Roger Waters said that Sid didn't want to become a pop star, but he did. Waters did. You also have Waters saying that the family blamed him for Sid's breakdown, but that's not fair.
Well, when I spoke to Rosemary Breen, his sister, she said that both her and her mother had for a while sort of blamed the band or blamed going to London and becoming involved in the music scene for the problems. I can't remember exactly what she says. It's in the book, but I think she says, I know that there was more to it than that. I mean, Roger Waters tends to make quite sort of broad statements about these things, but I do think there was a sense of they thought he was always going to be a painter. And what happened is he took what he thought was going to be a year out of Camberwell Art College to go and play in a band and see how that worked out for a year or so. And of course, he never went back.
Well, we've talked
Yeah.
quite a lot about Sid Barrett, and as you say, he went for a year, and he actually didn't last. Once they made it, he was not a year before he collapsed out of the band.
That's right, yeah.
And most people, if they think of Pink Floyd, they think of The Dark Side of the Moon and The Wall and the huge album sales and productions. But it took Floyd a long time to get there. After Sid left, they needed a songwriter, and nobody really expected Roger Waters to step up. In fact, I think Rick Wright was the one that people thought would.
Yeah.
He wrote a pop song. He sold a pop song before Floyd made it.
He sold a pop song before Floyd made it. Yeah, I mean, I can't remember the name of it. It's in the book. You've probably got it
it's
written.
called "You're the Reason
You've
Why."
got it written down there.
And it
You're
was
ahead of me.
By
Yeah.
Adam, Mike and Tim, 1964.
There we
I
are.
looked it up on YouTube. It's not very good. I have to say, it's a really slow read for me, this book, because everything that you reference, I either go and get the CD and
Oh, well,
listen to
fair
it,
enough.
or
Yeah.
I went to YouTube to, that's interesting. I didn't know about that.
Yeah.
So, yes. So I listened to "You're the Reason Why." Not very good.
Okay, yeah, I have listened to it. It was a while back now. But yes, he'd sold a song before any of them were, could barely play their instruments, I think. But I think just to backtrack a little bit, I mean, you've obviously got The Piper at the Gates of Dawn, the first Pink Floyd album comes out. There's 2 hit singles around that time.
But they're not on that album.
They're not on the
Because
album because
Floyd
people
were being
did,
a bit.
but people
precious
didn't
about
tend to
it.
put singles on albums at that time. It wasn't uncommon in the 60s not to put your single on the album.
Yeah, but Floyd refused to play them in concerts as well.
Well, they did. There is some
eccentric.
suggestion they did play them, but I mean, some people say they never did. But if you listen to live recordings from around the time the album's out, they're not playing the hits, no, which didn't go down very well. But I think that's an important thing is that they'd had 2 bona fide hit singles. They'd gone on top of the pops. They were signed to EMI. They were earmarked to be, they were seen as psychedelic, but they were earmarked to be a pop group. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, by January 1968, they're carrying on without him. He'd stopped turning up for sessions. He'd stopped turning up for, I think there was a few gigs he didn't turn up at, or when he turned up, he didn't play properly.
Or he'd play everything on one
Play
string.
everything on one string. So it's worth talking about that because that decline happens really quite quickly. People I spoke to said they saw a noticeable change in summer 1967. Some say it was lasted later, but by the time they're on the road, they're touring with Hendrix in November 67, and that's when he started missing gigs. And his, not sometimes he was on, sometimes he wasn't, and
the Floyd solution is to bring in
his mate,
his best mate, actually.
bring in his mate from Cambridge
Yeah.
to come in as an additional.
Interestingly, Gilmour is a very accomplished musician.
Yeah, it's
and
the complete opposite.
was already. You've got him saying in the book he was savagely jealous that they had Piper at the Gates of Dawn out as an album, but he was a more accomplished musician.
Yeah,
than-
so he was a traditional blues-based, guitar player. He'd been playing guitar from a young age. He was a natural with it, and he'd been playing in covers groups around Cambridge. His covers band, Jokers Wild, were the group to book for your parties, and they played all the ballrooms, and then a version of them went out to France and played in clubs in Paris. So they followed the arc. Gilmour's group start off playing the Beatles and the Beach Boys and the Four Seasons. By 67, they're doing Jimi Hendrix Experience and probably Cream, that kind of stuff. So, he could do that stuff. He could sing and he could play guitar.
And Sid Barrett originally, when he was Compos Mentis, he'd already sort of thought of having Gilmour
There's a letter he wrote
as a singer.
There was a letter he wrote to after they did that demo tape in January 65. And there's a couple of letters quoted in the book where he's not confident about his voice. It's his first time in a recording studio. Didn't like the sound of his voice. One of their friends makes fun of him about the voice, and there's a letter where he said that it basically says, "I wish I could get Fred," which was David Gilmour's nickname at the time. "I wish I could get Fred into the group, but he's got his own thing going on." So he's very present when you look at what happened. But that's what happened. The idea was that they'd bring David Gilmour in, but Sid would kind of sit at home and write the songs. And of course, or perform
in a sort of Beach Boys way.
In a Beach
with,
Boys,
yeah.
very much. I think that was the example that was used. And they did do a handful of gigs with 5 of them, but it didn't work out.
And you have the story in the book. It's also in Nick Mason's account of Pink Floyd, his own account. He says one day we had just looked at each other and said, "Shall we pick up Sid?" And somebody said, "Nah."
That's right. They were on their way to a gig at Southampton University, I think, and they used to travel around in an old, might be in a Bentley, I think. And it was like, shall we pick him up? No, we won't. And it talks about it in the book. There was this enormous sense of relief because they'd had 6 months or so of him being unreliable and not knowing what they wanted to do. Suddenly they were able to go out on stage and perform, and they knew that someone wasn't going to flake out on them. So I think they've been very honest about that over the years. The guilt, there's an element of guilt, and I'm sure that came later. But
Gilmour always made sure that Sid had plenty of money. He always made sure that
that came later,
Sid's songs
much
got onto the
later on
compilation
when EMI started sort of looking at when they had a catalogue, and it was time to remarket that catalogue. There was definitely that came later. I think particularly in the 80s, these Floyd compilations, there were always some Sid songs on.
Yeah, there was a Floyd compilation in the 70s, a Relics that had Sid.
Yeah,
songs
well,
on
Relics
it as
was the really early one. I think that was some contractual obligation thing, but I think that was. I mean, it's a very important album, Relics. I think for a lot of people.
Oh, interesting. Tell me why.
Well, because it was cheap.
Okay.
So I'm 60. So just before I went to see Pink Floyd play the Wall at Earl's Court in 1980, records were expensive. You didn't have the internet. So you had to borrow off of friends, or you had to save up.
Pick them up second
hand.
I had a copy of Obscured by Clouds that was about a minute shorter than it should have been because it skipped on the beginning of all the tracks.
Yeah, you made an investment, didn't you? I mean, Relics came out in 1971, but it was reissued at some point, 76, 77, which is when I would have got it. And for me, it was then reissued in the 80s, early 80s. Now, I'm convinced that is a whole generation of kind of indie rock bands who started to discover Syd Barrett and early Floyd, do so because of Relics. Relics was dirt cheap. I had a cassette. It cost nothing. I played it to death. I knew that album back to front because it was a perfect primer for the early Floyd without investing in Source of Lost Secrets or Piper at the Gates of Dawn. You've got the singles, you've got the weird stuff like Interstellar Overdrive, you've got a couple of real oddities on there, you've got Bike. So I think Relics is the great undervalued Pink Floyd album, simply because I think there's a whole generation of people like me and others that are a bit younger who bought it.
I was in much the same boat.
Yeah, they bought it because it was dirt cheap. So, and it had a great cover.
After Sid left, it seems to me, and I think your book bears it out, it took the Floyd ages to get their voice right.
Absolutely.
And I mentioned Dark Side of the Moon. That was their 8th studio album.
Yes. Yeah.
It's true that Atom Heart Mother, their 5th studio album, did go to number 1, but it's not a very good record. And indeed, you quote David Gilmour in the book as saying it wasn't very good. In fact, you've got a great quote from him saying something like, with Oma Gummer and Atom Heart Mother, we thought we were onto something, we were working to it, but looking back, it was just floundering.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the beauty or the folly of youth, isn't it, as well? Though? I mean, they were younger guys. There's this thing that emerges from this book is that after Sergeant Pepper, the album suddenly becomes king. Suddenly you've got a new generation of groups. Led Zeppelin is another example. Pink Floyd, where the music it's not about singles. And as long as there were enough sales there and enough concert tickets sold, bands could have a career. And Pink Floyd, were at the top of the tree of EMI's Harvest imprint. That's where a lot of the progressive types were put.
Sort of Edgar Broughton.
Yeah, Edgar Broughton, but they were way ahead
Roy
of
Harper.
They were way ahead of all that stuff in terms of sales and that. But so they were able to maintain. And I think there was at that time film music was important. You mentioned Obscured by Clouds. They'd done a film soundtrack called More, a French art house film. It's
both of which they became albums.
But that was something. More was the one they did in
terrible.
68. Well, there's some good tracks I like on it.
There's a Nile song.
The Nile song, which David Gilmour doesn't like. That's the heavy metal one.
Yeah.
I like the Nile song.
I like that too.
But I think there's
And that was
bits,
on Relics as well.
That's on Relics as well. But there's bits from those albums. You can cherry pick bits out of it. But at the time, they were selling.
I did think Obscured by Clouds was great.
Yeah, Obscured by
I thought it had
Clouds,
lots
but
of good
that's
music.
a bit later on, isn't it? By the time they sort of found their
but
voice.
Again, it was for a movie. It was for La Vallée, the Barbet movie. And it occupies a very strange place for Pink Floyd because they were making Dark Side of the Moon, and then they got hired for this film and went off and spent 3 weeks in France making Obscured by Clouds, which sounds great.
Yeah, I think they did it for the money, perhaps. I think, they'd worked with Barbet Schroeder before he'd done the film More. But I think, again, it's that thing of idea. There's a lot of ideas flying around. I mean, Nick Mason told me that they'd pitched to do the music for 2001: A Space Odyssey. With Kubrick, and they couldn't get that. He thinks they got turned down because they wanted too much money. I mean, and that would have been in 1969.
Yeah.
So they were exploring lots of avenues at the time. The album was king. They'd said to EMI, "We're not doing singles anymore," mainly because the singles they'd done after Syd Barrett hadn't sold, hadn't been hits. They weren't as good. So they concentrated on albums, and I think there was a lot of conflicting and different ideas flying around. But as you said, Atom Heart Mother went to number 1. I mean, even Ummagumma.
Even though it's not very good.
No, but even Ummagumma went to number 3. So there's this audience.
Ummagumma's atrocious.
It's
At least
atrocious.
the studio.
But
Ummagumma, of course, it's a studio album, and then there's a live
half
album as
live.
well.
Yeah, it's half.
But the studio stuff is awful.
The studio stuff has not aged well.
Oh,
It's
you're
not,
a tactful
No,
man,
I'm
Mark.
not tactful, really, because the first Pink Floyd song I ever heard was from Ummagumma.
Was it?
When I was about 10 or 11, a friend of mine, his older sister, had a copy of Ummagumma, and he went, "Have a listen to this. There's a song called Careful with the Axe, Eugene." And
But
I'd never...
that was on the live.
That was on the live stuff.
Yeah,
but
no, that
I'd
was great.
never
The live
heard
album was good.
music that sounded like that or had a title like that. Because as a 10 or 11-year-old, all the pop music I'm going to know is going to be what comes through the radio or is on top of the pops. So I just remember being slightly fascinated by it. But we didn't go beyond Careful with the Axe, Eugene. And had we flipped over onto the other two sides, the studio stuff, the Grand Vizier's garden party and all this stuff. I mean, it's not listenable. It's not
No,
stuff.
it's not.
It's not stuff I would go back to. I did listen to it in the process of doing this book. I thought I'm going to have to listen to Ummagumma again. The live stuff I loved. The studio side, apart from one or two bits and pieces, is hard work now. But then again, it's a hit album. Imagine how many records you had to sell to get a number 3 album in 1969. It's incredible.
It is amazing, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it's hard to imagine a band getting that much room these days.
Yeah.
Before you get, I keep circling back to Dark Side of the Moon. Before we leave it, we've got to do some of the stats. Do you remember what the stats are for
No.
how many copies it sold?
I have no idea.
It's closing on 50 million. I mean, it says in your book, it's closing on 50 million copies of Dark Side of the Moon worldwide, which is eye-watering. I gather it spent something like 700 consecutive weeks in the top 100 in the charts. Well, it's like 13 years.
Yeah.
It's just an absolute monster. It changed everything for the Floyd.
Yeah, I mean, to me, the jump, even from Medal, which was the album they did in 1971.
Which was a good album.
Medal was really good, but for me, even the jump from Medal to Obscured by Clouds to Dark Side of the Moon is incredible. It feels like in the space of 3 years, 2 to 3 years, everything seems to suddenly fall into place. That's that sort of chemistry that if you knew how to do it, there'd be more Pink Floyds, there'd be more bands that have that ability. I still marvel at how we talk. You're talking about those studio sides from Ummagumma. That's only 4 years before that. How do you get from that stuff, that noise, to
the triumph of Dark Side of the Moon.
to things like Time and Brain Damage and The Great Gig in the Sky? This stuff. Everything starts to sort of coalesce.
Do Pink Floyd understand how?
I don't know. I think they do. I remember doing an interview with David Gilmour, and I said, "Look, tell me what you felt like when you first played the album back in full," because he said because they'd been working on it for such a long period of time, and it was fragmented, as you said. They sort of buggered off to France to make Obscured by Clouds, or they'd work on it for a few weeks.
Or played five-a-side football in Studio One.
or something like that. So they'd stop recording and go and do some gigs.
Yeah.
They didn't. It wasn't focused and concentrated.
Oh, but they were playing Dark Side of the Moon on those
and
gigs.
they were playing it almost
that
a
was
year
interesting.
before.
That was an unusual approach.
I think it's unusual by today's standards, because if you came on stage and said we're going to do our brand new record, which we haven't finished making, everyone would get up and go to the toilet and go to the bar. And
we don't know they didn't.
No, we don't, but I suspect they probably didn't then, because I think there was a different kind of approach. I think the mindset might have been slightly different. But so I don't know, unless you ask someone, did you feel horribly challenged by listening to this new music that you didn't know? But I think it's incredibly brave to do that. I mean, the album was but the work developed. So what started off playing live changed by the time it gets onto the record. It's almost like they road tested it to see what worked and what didn't work. But again, going back to the point with David Gilmour, I said, look, what did you feel? What do you think? He said, when we first heard it all spliced together, whole thing, we all thought, yeah, that is fantastic. They all felt incredibly confident about it. And I find in talking, you mentioned David Gilmour's comments about Atom Heart Mother, they're very self-critical. As musicians, I think they are very self-critical. They're not afraid to say that some of the stuff they did before wasn't very good.
Now, some of them are critical about each other.
Yeah,
we're
well,
going to talk
other thing,
about
yeah.
the personnel in
Yeah.
a moment, but there are comments about Roger Waters not being much of a bassist. You've got a quote from Rick Wright saying I had to tune his bass for him.
There was actually,
during-
yeah. There's another one from David Gilmour later on, though, where he says Roger Waters was the best Roger Waters bass player there is.
That's a very underhanded... Because
Exactly.
in fact...
That's what I love about
David
it.
Gilmour, their guitarist, played half the bass lines on Pink
Well, he
Floyd
did, and I
albums.
put that to him a couple of months ago, and he sort of backtracked on that. He insisted that he played on one or two, and he couldn't remember what they were.
That brings us to actually, because the other big story about Pink Floyd is the relationship between the characters, in particular David Gilmour and Roger Waters. And when they express themselves, they're very middle class, these men. They come from a middle class background, and they express themselves in measured, fairly polite tones, saying really vicious things to
Yeah,
about
that's
each
exactly
other.
how they are. But that is an honest representation, I think, of who they are as individuals. If you go back and look at the early footage of them talking, David Gilmour and Roger Waters are posher when they talk when they were younger. Waters particularly, that sort of has declined.
Yeah.
And he does a sort of slightly theatrical faux Cockney thing.
Because he's a man of the people now.
That he
isn't
does.
he?
I don't know if it's less to do
No,
with that. I
it's
think
not.
it's just an affectation that's
Yeah.
sort of quite amusing. David Gilmour's sort of the same, but again, very, very measured.
And very measured.
Very
But-
measured when there's a microphone in front of
Yeah.
him. Slightly less measured when there isn't.
Oh, and I think they screamed at each other. They had blazing rows.
Yeah, I think there
sometimes.
were a lot of rows. I think that creative friction, though, is part of what makes the records as good as they are. I mean, talking about Dark Side of the Moon, there was a lot of push and pull over how that should sound. A lot of the sound effects, the things that we now take for granted on that record, those voices in the background and some of the effects. That was something Roger Waters was really, really pushing for. The other side, you've got David Gilmour, who's all about the music, but they meet in the middle, and you end up with an album, like you say, that sold 50 million copies.
David Gilmour, I think, is a very attractive. Do I mean pretty?
A very
Actually, he was
handsome- a very
gorgeous. He
handsome
was
man.
absolutely gorgeous, but I don't mean that. That's not where I'm coming from. But he was absolutely gorgeous to look at. But he's a very attractive character because he's so sort of centered, and he seems to have boundless self-confidence, as well as probably the best ear in rock music for how a record should sound.
I don't know. Well, I mean, I don't know if I could say he got the best ear. I'm not sure.
I think Pink Floyd records sound wonderful.
They do. I think that's a combination of him, Waters, the engineers, the producers.
You think
that he
Waters
worked
has
with.
got it? Because I think Waters is close to being a genius. He's a wonderful songwriter, but his solo records, some of them,
Oh, his solo. I can't
very
listen. No, I
hard
can't
to
listen
listen
to
to.
most of his solo records. I can't because it misses a David Gilmour or a Rick Wright.
yes,
So I think that's the thing. But I think in terms, I can't analyze the way those records came out. How much of it, if you take Dark Side of the Moon, how much of it was just David Gilmour or just Chris Thomas who mixed it,
or Alan Parsons,
or Alan Parsons? I think it's a combination of things. I think you mentioned about David Gilmour's self-confidence. I think he's had a lot of confidence as a musician and as a guitar player. And there's stories in the book, even as a younger man, he kind of, people said to me, he knew he was good and that he was going to make it. But of course, he's a very sort of, he's not a rock star in the traditional sense that, a Keith Richards or even someone like an Eric Clapton is or something. He's predominantly been a band player.
Yeah.
It's only solo.
and he's nothing like the songwriter that Roger Waters.
No, he's
is.
not. And not in terms of the ideas. And I think the thing that comes across, I found doing this, but Roger Waters had these bottomless well of ideas, some good, some bad, some indifferent. But he was the guy coming in at the beginning of Dark Side of the Moon, Wish You Were Here, Animals, The Wall, and probably before that, going, I've got an idea. What about an album about real life? What about an album about absence? What about this wall? Here are some lyrics. These are ideas that I've got. And where Pink Floyd works is that when he threw that against the others, they then spun it into something. And I think Roger Waters' stuff on its own, the idea is king. The idea is most important. The lyrics are most
of course,
important.
Roger Waters has just re-recorded
He re-recorded Dark Side of the Moon because
sort of stripping out all that tedious musicianship that
Yes,
David Gilmour and
yes.
Rick Wright put in.
Yeah.
And it sounds awful.
Yeah, it's not good at all. I've listened to it twice.
Oh, good for
more,
you.
Well, I had to listen to it for purposes of the book, but I was I was looking forward to it.
It was intriguing.
I wanted to hear what it is, but it's not a
Not
record.
agreeable.
It's not a record I'm going to put on for pleasure.
No, especially if you can put on the original.
The
Dark
original
Side of the
first one still works
Yeah.
for me, but I think that is the thing. I think the idea and the lyric comes first and foremost. If you listen to some of his solo albums, I can't remember. There's a track on one of them where he's got P.P. Arnold singing, fabulous old soul singer, and she's having to sing too many words.
Yeah.
And there's a point in the book where David Gilmour says that he'd said to Roger Waters on one of the tracks that later ends up on Animals, "There's too many words. I can't. It doesn't scan right. I can't get the words out quickly." And so he rewrote it. Left to his own devices, he's got P.P. Arnold kind of falling over herself to get these words out. And I think that illustrates what it is, because for him the message was key, whereas I think with Gilmour the music comes first.
Is there a sense in which Dark Side of the Moon was the beginning of the end? I mean, they were never going to be able to scale those heights again.
Well,
It
no.
also seems as though Roger Waters started to think he could do it without the other
Well,
guys.
Roger Waters said to me when I first interviewed him that he thought Dark Side of the Moon was the beginning of the end.
Oh, he
No,
did.
or maybe he said it was with the Wall. He changes. He changed, but there was 25 years in between. So he's fine to change his mind. I think there's that sense that suddenly they became hugely successful, massive in America, which they hadn't been before. That was a game changer. Big in America, and then they became financially. The big money starts to come in within a year or so. So, suddenly you're buying a big house and a better car, and you're not all crammed in the back of the car going to the gig anymore.
Still and all, they go on to make a handful of wonderful albums.
great records. Yeah.
So it's not as if the wheels fell off immediately.
No, they didn't. Not in the slightest.
But
no.
there may have been an inevitability about it.
But it was. I mean, they struggled with the follow-up to Dark Side of the Moon, which is Wish You Were Here,
Which is lovely.
which is probably my favourite of the album. It's coming out again because it's a 50th anniversary. But that was an arduous record to make by all accounts, because they didn't really know what they wanted to do, particularly after Dark Side of the Moon.
So
I think
they look
felt
back to Sid Barrett and make an album about the absence of...
Well, there was part. Yeah, I think Sid Barrett's a part of it. I don't think it's all about that, but I mean, there was a lot of marital fallings out going on around that time within the band. I think. I mean, Roger Waters' first marriage ended, which he talked about very candidly,
in the book.
and I
It's very
think there's quite a bit of that in the song "Wish You Were Here." David Gilmour says he often thinks about Sid Barrett when he sings "Wish You Were Here." I mean, I don't know. I think you can project your own thoughts onto it. There's definitely that cynicism about the music business creeping into Waters' lyrics. Have a cigar, that's the one particularly. And Welcome to the Machine. These all seem to suggest a man very sort of disillusioned by the machinations of the music business, but of course a man who is now becoming incredibly wealthy, has just bought a big house somewhere, and has a lot more money in his bank account. He's become the pop star in a sense
That he
wanted to be
yeah.
without while remaining anonymous. Because this is the other thing. They're still not doing hit singles. They can still walk down the road.
They don't put their faces on
They're
the
not
covers
getting
of
mobbed.
albums.
It's not like Mark Bolan. You go out in the street and you're Roger Waters, you're not getting mobbed.
We ought to quickly mention the other guys in the band,
Yeah,
because
very
there was
much
Rick
so.
Wright, who was their keyboards player, who was musical in if that's not absurd to point out, and Nick Mason, Nick Mason's a very interesting character. He seems to have sort of sat above the whole thing. In his book, again, of course, I read his book about Pink Floyd. He calls himself Rock's Vicar of Bray. The the figure who...
Neville Chamberlain is the other one that he's compared himself to.
the winds blow this way and that way, and Nick wound up playing every Pink Floyd gig.
He's on every Pink Floyd album. Yeah,
He's on every Pink Floyd, and that's not true of anybody else.
It's not. No, it's not. He's the sole original member of the band. I mean, again, he's not a songwriter. So he's been incredibly lucky to be in a band with people that can write these.
Well, you have him saying that in the book.
these
That,
songs, yeah.
a band lives or dies by
Well, this is-
whether there's somebody who can come up with the
Whether someone
material.
come up with an idea, and he was very good friends with Roger Waters. They were great friends at college, and that's sort of how it happened. Yeah, I mean, I think in recent years, what Nick Mason has done brilliantly is he's become a sort of ambassador for Pink Floyd. You mentioned he'd written his own book a few years ago, but he is the one that was the most amenable and kind of user friendly. When I was on the staff of music magazines, you kind of knew that you could get Nick on the phone if something was Floyd related was coming out. He would do it. David Gilmour less so. So Nick, I think Nick was also an archivist. He had diaries and stuff. He kept stuff from the early years. So I think he's had a very good life out of being in Pink Floyd.
Oh yeah, he loves racing cars, and he
did the
buys
race.
them,
He did
collects them,
yeah,
and
he
races
did
them,
all
doesn't
that.
he?
I think he's retired with all that now. But that was a big part of his life for many years, and it's been enabled by being in such a successful band. Yeah.
Meanwhile, Rick Wright had a much more torrid time with Pink Floyd.
Yeah,
as it
he was
went
a
on.
gentler
Roger
character.
Waters fired him from the
Well,
band.
he got fired from the band, and the others sort of let it happen. But I think he lost his way in the mid-70s. He co-wrote a lot of this material, a lot of the stuff on Dark Side of the Moon.
and a lot of the voices on.
A lot of the
Pink Floyd
voices,
are
that's
him.
the other thing. I mean, his voice and David Gilmour's voice together combine beautifully,
Mm.
particularly on Dark Side of the Moon and things like Echoes.
Whereas nobody could describe Roger Waters as a singer.
No, he's not. But then
does a lot
I
of the vocals,
like the fact what makes it work. His voice is brilliant on certain songs. And there are certain songs that I couldn't imagine David Gilmour singing, and there are others that you couldn't flip it the other way round. That is the awful, awkward chemistry between the two. Because I think if you listen to things like Brain Damage and Eclipse on Dark Side of the Moon and that, you need Waters singing that stuff. For me that works, especially on the Wall. But Rick Wright was if you're going to have an unsung hero in Pink Floyd, it's Richard Wright, definitely.
And David Gilmour, who he was great friends with.
Well,
Rick Wright.
yeah, I mean,
He gives him a lot of
he
credit.
gave him a lot of credit, and before he died, Richard Wright came back out and toured with David Gilmour's solo band in 2006, a couple of years before he died, and had a great time. And there was a lot of love for him from audiences. People liked having him there on stage. But it's worth pointing out that, when he was fired, the others didn't stop him being fired.
I was going to ask about that.
No,
he
they
was
didn't.
great mates with Gilmour, and Gilmour let it happen.
They all let it happen, apart from, obviously Roger Waters, who made it happen. He wasn't the story is he was not pulling his weight as a songwriter or as a player. Richard Wright,
And he did have
denied that.
substance abuse issues. didn't
Well,
he?
I don't know.
Did he
I
drink too
don't
much,
know.
or-
I don't. It's difficult to say because was there a lot of alcohol and was there a lot of cocaine around the band at various points? Yes, absolutely, but not exclusive to Rick Wright. And I'm not suggesting everybody indulged. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't. But there was definitely a lot of good times to be had. In terms of enjoying the excesses. I don't know. I honestly don't know I don't believe that's the sole reason. I just think he stopped functioning. And I think he maybe was a gentler character. He was a softer character than David Gilmour. David Gilmour was very tough and would stand up to Roger Waters. And I don't think Rick Wright was necessarily like. It's different personalities. He was always a bit put upon. He was always, they teased him mercilessly from when he was a young guy in the band. But of course, years later, you come to realize he's a massive contribution to that band. But he'd stopped functioning, and that's the story, and that's why they got rid of him.
I want to spend a little time talking about the imagery, because although it's not about the music necessarily, the imagery of Pink Floyd has been hugely important and has had vast impact. It goes back to Cambridge, doesn't it? It's friends from Cambridge.
Friends from Cambridge, yes, Storm Thorgerson and Aubrey Powell, who's known as Poe, who were two friends of theirs from Cambridge. They moved down to London around the same time Pink Floyd did. And Storm was at film school. Poe was designing sets for the BBC. Then he got arrested and nearly sent to prison. And then he ended up driving a van for Pink Floyd, driving their lights around. And then Storm took him under his wing and said, I'll teach you to be a photographer. And between the two of them, they got a commission to do the second Pink Floyd album, to do a cover, Source Full of Secrets. And from then on, they did all the Floyd covers up to Animals.
And I mean, firstly, the imagery is fantastic.
Yeah.
The cows on the front of Atom Heart Mother. Everybody remembers the prism on Dark Side of the Moon, of course, and the flying pig.
Yeah.
Over Battersea. I mean, it was a great studio coming up with all of this stuff, and they made an industry out of it. Didn't they? It was.
They became Hypnosis. It was an art house, as they like to call themselves. I mean, Storm Thorgerson was the art guy. He was the ideas guy. Poe was the more practical one that took a lot of the photos and made it happen. Again, I've written a lot about Hypnosis over the years, and I knew Storm and I know Aubrey Powell well.
Because Storm's dead now.
Storm's dead now, but I work with Storm, and I've worked a lot with Aubrey Powell since then. And they were like a band in themselves, rubbing each other up the wrong way, throwing cameras at each other, arguing.
Oh, and always insisting on doing things the hard way.
Always insisting on things doing. Yeah.
Rather than a mock-up or something, they'd go out and photograph
They go and
thousands of miles away.
They go and
for real.
Yeah, absolutely. They'd photograph a man on fire. They set a man on fire for Wish You Were Here. And I mean,
and for momentary lapse of reason,
that was later on. That was Storm Thorgerson on his own. Yeah, hundreds of beds
on a beach. So they got hundreds of beds and put them on a beach.
They had put hundreds of beds on a beach. I think there's a quote from David Gilmour saying, "Couldn't we have just done 20 and put the rest in?" But that's by the 80s, so desktop publishing's come in by then. In the 70s, they did it for real. And you mentioned it became an industry. They went away for lots of other bands to exotic locations, on the record company dollar, and photographed footballs in the middle of the Sahara Desert and so on and so forth. And this is what they did with Pink Floyd. And again, they took the band off the cover. It meant the image. The band wasn't featured on the cover. And that's something that gave it a mystique. When I first saw Dark Side the Moon leafing through somebody's record collection when I was 13, I ignored all the other albums and took that album out and wanted to listen to it. I was fascinated by the fact they didn't have the band name on the cover. I had to look to see who it was by. And I think that's sort of discovery.
That's a kind of swaggering self-confidence.
It is. It's a lot of self-confidence, but it worked. It's a formative memory for me of music, is going, well, what is this record? I have to listen to this because of the cover.
It's interesting that Pink Floyd allowed them to spend that kind of money, because Floyd were, they did themselves quite proud, but they were not fantastically generous with credit or
in any way, shape or form.
Or money, really.
Well, I think it's.
I think they were personally generous. Gilmour was personally generous with money, but not with Pink Floyd money.
Well, I think there's this thing of the art comes first. The art is more important than the commerce. This seems to be some mantra. That was Pink Floyd's mantra as well. So,
but the credit you've got. The famous one is Claire Torrey, who sang the vocal on The Great Gig in the Sky, and had to fight 30 or 40 years later to get the credit for the work she'd done, because she got 40 quid or something to come.
That's right, but she was a session singer, and that's how that's kind of how it worked in those days. But I think they, as you say, they were weirdly tight-fisted in some ways. But then what they loved about Storm and Hypnosis was the fact that they were as uncompromising as they were. So I think they indulged it much to. Did
it help that they were old friends from?
I suspect it helped.
It was like a gang that they.
Possibly, but then they weren't afraid to sort of put him down. Storm was a very combative man.
You have a wonderful story about he in one of the box sets.
Yes,
he included marbles, a little bag of marbles.
That's right, and there's a couple of them. Yeah,
go on, tell me why.
Because he said, and I said, look, what is this? He pulled out this velvet pouch of marbles. It was for Wish You Were Here, for one of the other reissues. I said, what is this for? He said, because you must have lost your marbles to pay for these expensive box sets. So we're giving them back to you. But I love the fact that EMI were willing, or people were willing to pay for this nonsense, because it was expensive to put that. And
it was.
And people were going, you'd open the box and go, what the fuck are these marbles doing falling?
And it was just Storm's little.
It was Storm's.
You must have lost your marbles here or something.
It's just this ridiculous, idiosyncratic sense of humour, but it was still being indulged in this century.
Okay, there's another thing we have to ask about Pink Floyd, and it's an argument that's been had in pubs the world over, are they prog rock? Are they proper prog rock?
I think they are, but I think they'd hate you saying that.
Oh,
I
would they?
think David Gilmour and Roger Waters particularly would hate you saying that. I don't think they have any affinity with any of the music that you lump into that.
Well, they're not
group.
Techno Flash, are
No,
they?
no, they're not. They're not
virtuoso
Emerson,
prog
Lake
rock.
and Palmer, or
Yes,
or Genesis, or Jethro Tull. The uncomfortable truth is, though, is that the people that bought Pink Floyd records in the 70s and in the 80s, and people that like it now, also own music by those bands. And when I listened to when I discovered Pink Floyd, the next record along I would have heard would have been Genesis or the Yes album.
King Crimson.
King Crimson, all of that stuff. I mean, David Gilmour was once asked, list these bands in order that you hate them the least. And it was Yes, Genesis, ELP, I think King Crimson. He said King Crimson was the one he hated the least. I think Yes might have been the one he hated the most, but I'm not sure about that. But, he's a Bob Dylan fan, a Neil Young fan. Roger Waters is a massive Neil Young fan. And they're not going out and listening to the next Marillion album. But the fact is that a lot of that audience love Pink Floyd. So I think it's a bit churlish to say they're not, because I think their audience have made them that. And I know Nick Mason. I've seen Nick Mason at a Genesis concert. He was sat behind me, so he's guilty as charged. and when I interviewed Rick Wright, I know he was a Genesis fan. But don't get Gilmour and Waters on that. They hate it. They absolutely hate it.
I'll bear that in mind. I'm going to ask you one final question, and it's the final judgment. Where do Pink Floyd sit in the pantheon of rock?
I think very high up. I mean, you've got the Beatles. What have you got? The Beatles, the Stones, Zeppelin, Floyd. I mean, purely in commercial terms of that generation of '60s bands. I do think they sit very high up, and I think it's interesting they sit high up because unlike the Beatles, unlike the Stones, they've done it off albums, very much like Led Zeppelin in that sense. They did it purely off albums. Now, what's going to be interesting is how much Pink Floyd music you now hear being licensed for films and TV and adverts, which hasn't happened before because Sony bought the catalogue, they own it, they can do what they want with it. So I think it's going to be really interesting over the next few years because I think another generations will discover this music.
Well, how are David and Roger going to feel about that?
It doesn't matter. They gave up their rights to it.
But they can be a bit precious.
They can be precious as they want. They gave up their rights to it. And this is something David Gilmour talks about. He says, I'm prepared for the fact that there may be things that I wouldn't necessarily want to do, but that, I will hear it. Will you hear Wish You Were Here in a travel advert, a holiday advert? That's my question. And you might think, oh God, but I don't know. But then I could imagine "Shine On You Crazy Diamond" being used in some Marvel. We're looking where we are now, Marvel stuff up on the wall.
Yeah.
I could imagine it being in some sci-fi blockbuster. Imagine that.
And then it'll be
a
another box
spaceship,
set
and then it's
of,
begins with "Shine On You Crazy Diamond." Those opening notes as the spaceship hoves into view.
Oh, it would work.
But that's what's going to happen, regardless of what they think or what their existing audience thinks.
They're rich enough they didn't have to do it, so I guess they're...
Well, they wanted to be shot of it. They wanted to be shot of the arguments. I think that's a motivation as well, because now they've got rid of the catalogue. Their managers don't have to sit down in a room together and thrash out the details for what they're going to do with it. It's now someone else's responsibility. And, I think there's been such a breakdown between David Gilmour and Roger Waters in terms of their personal opinions of each other. Now their grievances have been aired publicly, but now they don't have to worry about it. They finally managed to sell it. It's someone else's responsibility.
That underlines the sort of the story of Pink Floyd.
The story of Pink Floyd, and this is it. And this is where I think the music is going to survive and be heard by future generations, because it's going to start being used in films and in places where you never hear Floyd music used anywhere. Now that is going to change,
The book is Shine On, Pink Floyd, The Definitive Oral History by Mark Blake. It's published by New Modern at £25, and it's full of fascinating and revealing stuff. Mark, thank you very much.
Thanks
indeed.
very much. Great to be here. Thank you.
This was the Books Podcast. If you haven't already subscribed, please do so, and thank you very much.
That was the Books Podcast, presented by Tim Haig. Email Tim on tim@bookspodcast.com, Twitter @bookspodcast, and Facebook @bookspodcasttim.